She thought she was just doing her job, serving coffee 30,000 feet in the air. But one glance at a young boy in a sharp suit made her smirk. To her, he didn't belong in first class. Too young, too dark, too out of place. She didn't know that her judgment would soon ignite a storm she could never take back. Because the boy she silently mocked wasn't just any passenger. He was about to change everything. She thought she knew about worth, race, and power. What happens when prejudice meets unexpected truth? Thousands of feet above the clouds, the morning of the flight began like any other for 8-year-old Jordan. His aunt had helped him button up the little navy suit he loved so much, a birthday gift from his late mother. She told him to keep his chin up, to always walk proud. Today he was flying alone for the first time, heading to meet his father, a man he hadn't seen since his mother passed. The airport buzzed with noise and color, but Jordan moved carefully, clutching his tiny briefcase as if it carried the whole world inside. To the other passengers, he was just a boy playing dress-up. None knew how deeply that suit meant to him, how it made him feel safe, grown, and close to the woman who'd believed he could be anything. As he boarded the plane, sliding quietly into his seat in first class, he smiled. He didn't notice the eyes that lingered on him a little too long, the whispers that followed. Nor did he see the flight attendant across the aisle shaking her head in quiet disbelief. For Jordan, this flight was a step toward healing. For her, it would be a lesson written thousands of feet above the ground, one both of them would never forget. The cabin lights dimmed as the last passengers settled in. Jordan couldn't stop staring out the window, his breath fogging the glass, excitement bubbling quietly inside him. He was going to see his dad. He imagined the man waiting at the arrivals gate, proud and smiling. Everything felt bright for a moment. Then, the footsteps came. The flight attendant, Miranda, glided through the aisle, her practiced smile perfectly polite. But when her eyes landed on Jordan sitting alone in first class, that smile faltered. She hesitated, the kind of pause that seems small but carries an entire story within it. A story of assumptions. She scanned her seating chart, then looked back at him, her brow creasing slightly as if he had slipped into the wrong world by accident. Jordan didn't notice at first. He was busy trying to open the little tray table and line up the toy plane his mom had given him. When Miranda leaned closer, her tone softened with forced sweetness. She asked if he was lost. He told her proudly, "No, ma'am, I'm in 2A. He even held out his boarding pass just like his aunt had taught him. Miranda looked at the ticket, then at him, the rich blue of his suit, the shine of his new shoes, and let out a quiet chuckle that landed heavier than any insult. Other passengers began to glance over, sensing something but not saying a word. Silence in first class was sharp. Judgment rarely needed volume. Miranda told the boy his seat was for premium flyers, her lips curling just slightly around the word premium. Jordan's heartbeat picked up. He didn't understand why she was speaking that way, but he knew enough. He had seen that look before, the one that made people shrink a little smaller, even when they had done nothing wrong. When he insisted that this was his seat, she frowned and suggested they double-check. She picked up his small bag, ignoring his quiet protest, and called another crew member. Now the stares weren't quiet curiosity anymore. They were whispers, half-hidden eyes, and faint smirks. The man beside Jordan turned his newspaper up like a wall. Someone behind sighed, impatient that the flight was taking so long. Miranda's voice echoed across the cabin. "We'll sort this out in economy, sweetheart." The word sweetheart sliced through his chest. Jordan looked down, realizing people were watching him, judging him, wondering why someone like him was sitting here. His eyes stung as the attendant guided him out, one light push on his shoulder after another, until he stood in the narrow aisle with all those eyes behind him. The air outside the first-class cabin felt different, colder somehow. Miranda kept walking, expecting him to follow her to the back, but something inside Jordan began to tighten. He wasn't sure if it was anger or shame, but it burned. His mother's voice echoed faintly in his head. "Never bow your head, baby." That voice stopped him. He refused to take another step. Miranda turned, frowning now, her customer service mask slipping. She asked him what was wrong. He didn't answer. He just held his boarding pass up again, the one that clearly said 2A his seat. The other attendant looked closer, realizing something was off. Jordan spoke quietly this time, barely audible. "This is my spot. That small act of standing his ground changed the tone. Passengers began murmuring. A woman in the nearby row whispered, "Let him sit." But Miranda's pride wouldn't let go easily. She tightened her posture, as if doubling down could erase her mistake. She suggested maybe there had been a booking error. Maybe the paper got switched. Each word chipped away at Jordan's confidence and the patience of those watching. The pilot's voice suddenly crackled over the intercom, announcing a minor delay. The timing made everything worse. Eyes stayed fixed, tension refused to fade. Jordan stood frozen near the curtain dividing the classes like a symbol. First class on one side, economy on the other, invisible lines drawn by assumption. Finally, another crew member emerged from the cockpit area, holding a passenger list. "Seat 2A, Jordan Thompson," she read aloud. "He's good." The silence that followed was enormous. Miranda's expression flickered, shock, then discomfort, then the kind of smile people wear when they want to pretend nothing happened. She apologized in a whisper no one could hear, but it was too late. Every passenger had seen the truth laid bare in the open cabin air. Jordan sat back down quietly, but that earlier excitement had drained away. The toy plane sat still on the tray table, untouched. The flight took off, engines roaring like distant thunder. Miranda avoided his eyes for the rest of the ride, overextending her kindness to everyone else instead, an apology measured out in empty politeness. Halfway through the flight, turbulence hit, shaking loose more than coffee cups. Miranda stumbled slightly, bracing herself against the seats. For a flicker of a second, she looked at Jordan again, not as a passenger, not as someone beneath her, but as a child she had wronged. The guilt began to set in, though no one said a word. Jordan stared out the window, the clouds passing under the wings like waves. He wasn't angry anymore, just tired. Somewhere behind the exhaustion was the awareness that he had been seen, not for who he was, but for who someone thought he couldn't be. The difference was heavy. As the plane descended, Miranda rehearsed an apology in her mind. She planned to make it sound gentle, careful, rehearsed like every corporate training video dictated. But destiny, as it often does, had other plans, because waiting at the arrivals gate wasn't just anyone. It was the CEO himself, Jordan's father. He stood tall, dressed in immaculate grey, the same calm authority that commanded rooms and headlines. When Miranda stepped into the terminal beside the passengers, she froze. The pieces clicked together. The boy in the suit, the first-class ticket, the name Thompson. Suddenly, the distance between what she'd assumed and what was real collapsed into one aching moment of recognition. But before she could speak, before she could explain, Jordan's father reached down and lifted his son into an embrace so full of pride it silenced the noise of the entire terminal. And Miranda realized the truth. The seat wasn't what defined worth, nor was the suit. It was the heart of the boy she'd dismissed, and the world that had quietly watched her do it. As the image locked in her memory, that lingering guilt turned into something heavier, the kind of weight that follows you long after the flight is over. And for the first time in years, she couldn't find the right words to say, because the story wasn't about her anymore. It never really was. The arrival hall hummed with movement and chatter, but for Miranda everything slowed. Jordan's father cut through the noise with a presence that demanded attention, the kind that made people straighten their posture without knowing why. He didn't even glance at anyone else. His eyes were locked on his son. Jordan ran to him, small arms wrapping around his waist, the little navy suit pressed against his father's tailored coat. For a moment the world seemed perfectly still, love, pride, relief, and belonging all colliding in that single embrace. Then the whispers started. Passengers exiting behind Miranda began murmuring, piecing together what they had just witnessed mid-flight. "That's his dad?" Someone breathed. "The CEO," said another. Miranda's stomach twisted. It wasn't just about being wrong. It was about what her disbelief had meant. Every detail flooded back, her skeptical voice, that mocking smirk, the tone she'd used, the entire chain of moments that had quietly stripped that boy of dignity. Now exposed in the bright terminal light, she couldn't hide behind professional poise or polite ignorance. Jordan's father turned briefly, as if sensing her stuttering presence behind the crowd. Their eyes met. He didn't need to speak. His look said it all. A disappointment too deep for words, mixed with the calm strength of someone used to reading people. not by status but by integrity. That gaze hit harder than anger could have. Miranda's breath hitched. For a heartbeat, she wanted to melt into the floor. The memory of her smirk burned like acid. She had spent years climbing through an industry ruled by appearances, service over sincerity, smiles over soul. Yet now, standing in front of the very people she had silently judged, she felt unbearably small. Meanwhile, Jordan, oblivious to the emotional storm rising around him, lifted his toy plane, showing his dad how he'd kept it safe the whole trip. His father crouched, taking the tiny aircraft gently in his hands. A proud smile spread across his face, softening his voice as he told Jordan he was brave, polite, and strong. Miranda overheard it, and every word struck deeper. Strong. That was the word she'd refused to see up there, when she'd seen only difference, not courage. A reporter nearby recognized the CEO, camera ready. In seconds, flashes went off. The story was already being told. Pictures of a black executive, his young son, and a uniformed attendant just a few feet away. The angle of truth was shifting, quickly and irreversibly. The CEO stood, adjusting his suit, lifting Jordan's little hand in his own. "You did great, son," he said warmly. Then he looked directly at Miranda. The crowd fell quiet, sensing something about to unfold. Miranda's throat tightened. Her apology hovered on her lips, but refused to come out clearly. She stammered about a misunderstanding, about a mix-up in seating. But no phrasing felt right. The truth was too simple to dress up. She hadn't believed the boy deserved to sit where he belonged. The CEO took a step closer, his voice calm but resonant, the kind that carried weight without raising volume. "You saw a little boy," he said quietly, "and assumed he couldn't belong in that seat. But he did, just like anyone else. He didn't shout, didn't raise accusation, yet the air thickened with the power of restraint, the kind that speaks louder than rage." He turned back to Jordan and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Remember this, son," he said gently. "You never have to earn the right to be treated with respect. Anyone who makes you feel otherwise isn't seeing clearly yet." Silence rippled through the onlookers. Miranda wanted to shrink, but part of her forced herself to listen, to hear what she had made him explain to his child. The man's tone wasn't just for his son, it was for her, and everyone standing close enough to feel the sting of truth. Jordan looked up and said softly, "It's okay." "Daddy, she didn't know." The innocence in his voice hit harder than any confrontation could. Miranda's chest tightened. Her own eyes burned. She realized that forgiveness, a child's forgiveness, carried more strength than her pride ever could. The CEO nodded, but didn't smile. "That may be true," he said quietly, "but one day she'll have to understand why she didn't know." The words lingered in the air like thunder long after the lightning strike. Then he folded the boarding pass Jordan had carried so proudly and slipped it into his pocket, a symbol of proof, of place, of worth. Miranda stood frozen long after they walked away. Passengers passed by, avoiding her eyes, the awkward hush of realization following her like a shadow. Every mechanical smile, every half-joking dismissal. They all came rushing back, bricks in the wall of small, invisible cruelties she'd helped build without ever calling them that. Outside, reporters began writing the story before the plane's engines even cooled. Flight attendant questions. Black child in first class. Turns out, he's the CEO's son. The headline would go viral, dissected on talk shows, comment sections, offices across the country. People would argue about intent versus harm, ignorance versus malice. But for Miranda, there was no debate left inside. Only the echo of her own laughter from the cabin, looping in memory until it became unbearable. She stumbled toward a bench near the gate as her mind replayed the moment she told him, "We'll sort this out in economy." Economy, as if that word meant your place. Her face burned when she remembered how small he'd looked walking behind her. Every laugh she'd shared with colleagues at passengers' expense suddenly felt cruel. The thin armor of professionalism had peeled away to reveal what she'd never wanted to admit. She had been trained not just to serve, but to judge. Her chest tightened, pulse hammering against her throat. That scene, Jordan's little shoulders hunched, the hush of shame on his face, would follow her far beyond this day. For him, it would become another scar in a collection the world gives too easily to boys like him. For her, it would be the moment her perfectly tidy world cracked, forcing her to see what she had looked through for years. Some passengers who had witnessed the event walked past, eyes averted, unwilling to acknowledge what had happened. But one woman from economy class stopped near her. She rested a hand briefly on Miranda's shoulder and said only, "Now you know." Then she walked away, leaving the words behind like an unshakable mirror. The sound of jet engines filled the glass corridor again, drowning everything else. Miranda turned to see Jordan in the distance, sitting on his father's shoulders, laughing now, free again, unburdened. The sight was both beautiful and brutal. It marked the end of his humiliation and the beginning of her reckoning. That was the moment Miranda understood. The real turbulence hadn't happened in the air. It was inside her, the storm she'd carried quietly all along. And this time there would be no seatbelt to hold her steady. In the days that followed, the story traveled faster than the plane ever could. News outlets picked it apart, social feeds churned with commentary, and people argued over who was right, who was wrong, and whether it was all a misunderstanding. But beneath the noise, the truth remained painfully simple. A child was humiliated for daring to belong someplace someone else thought he shouldn't. Jordan didn't understand the headlines or the debates. What he remembered was the feeling, the silence in that moment, the burn of 1,000 eyes that told him he'd stepped somewhere he didn't deserve to be. That kind of lesson seeps deep. It shapes how a child looks at the world, at fairness, at themselves. His father shielded him as best he could. He turned off the television, let his son play outside, and filled the house with laughter when he could. But one evening Jordan asked quietly, "Dad, how come she thought I couldn't sit there?" The question stopped the man cold. There was no easy way to explain centuries of prejudice to an 8-year-old boy who still believed everyone should be kind. So he told him this: "Some people haven't learned to see yet. But you keep being who you are, and maybe someday they'll open their eyes." Miranda's world changed too, but in a different way. The airline's corporate office handled the situation with its usual language: policy review, diversity training, sensitivity refreshers. Words lined up like sandbags against a flood, meant to protect reputation more than to rebuild humanity. She attended every session, quiet and pale, nodding at slide after slide about equality. But guilt doesn't evaporate with policy. It echoes. She returned to flying, though she carried that day like turbulence in her chest. Each time she looked down the aisles at her passengers, something inside her had shifted. Instead of scanning for who didn't belong, she started noticing who did, and how seldom they were treated like it. Every uniformed smile now hid a question behind it. Am I being kind or just being polite? A year later, on another routine flight, she saw a young black boy sitting near the window, knees swinging above the carpet. His suit was a little too big, his hair neatly combed and his eyes wide with excitement. Something in her froze. For a heartbeat, it all returned: the shame, the memory, the lesson. But this time she walked over, knelt slightly, and asked if he wanted the pilot's wings pin they sometimes gave to children. The boy grinned, nodded, and she pinned it gently to his jacket. As she walked away, she realized her hands were shaking, not from fear but from understanding. Redemption didn't erase what happened. It wasn't a neat movie ending, but it was something. A first step. She couldn't undo that day with Jordan, but she could honor its truth by never repeating it. And that's the part of the story that lingers long after the plane lands, how small moments reveal the depth of what society prefers to ignore. Prejudice often hides behind politeness, behind procedures, behind the lie of mistaken identity. But every mistake like that tells a child just one thing: that the world still measures worth by color before character. Jordan grew older, and over time, the memory of that flight softened around the edges, though it never disappeared entirely. It became a story he shared in classrooms, later in interviews, and eventually to his own children, less about the humiliation and more about what it taught him. He would tell them, "The world once treated me like I didn't belong in first class. So I worked to make a world where everyone deserves a seat, no sections, no labels, no barriers." And that's the hard truth this story leaves behind. Racism doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers in the tone of a flight attendant, in the doubt behind an employee's question, in the subtle disbelief that someone could simply deserve to be where they are. But it's also true that awareness begins in those moments when someone, even the one who erred, finally sees it. The hope isn't just for the victims to endure. It's for the witnesses to wake up. Because racism isn't just the story of those who suffer. It's also the story of the silent, the distracted, the ones who looked away when it happened in plain sight. Until those people decide to face it, it will keep boarding our flights, sitting in our schools, walking our streets. Miranda learned that too late for that boy, but not too late to change herself. And maybe that's where the real impact lies, not in perfection, but in awareness that refuses to fade once you've seen the truth. So as the camera pulls back from the image of that boy in his navy suit, boarding pass in hand, smiling despite it all, there's one question left hanging in the air, unanswered but urgent. How many more times will the world decide someone doesn't belong before it finally learns to see that they always did?